Hello, everyone. Okay.
Well, I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Lois Eveleth, professor of philosophy at Southern Virginia University in Newport, Rhode Island, of which she's a graduate. Professor Eveleth also studied at Providence College, Chicago, Fordham University, Walden University, and she's been teaching for many years American philosophy and ethics. But lately, she's been concentrating on professional ethics, and this is why today she is giving her speech or her lecture on professional responsibility and conflicts of interest. So, without further ado, let us welcome Professor Lois Eveleth.
Good morning. Good morning. I've distributed 2 items for your consideration, and I'll refer to the first one is an article from the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago in June about a study conducted by the American Medical Association and published in their journal. And as you'll see, I'll refer to it. It has to do with the gifts given to physicians from representatives of pharmaceutical companies, and then the correlation between that and the prescribing of medications as suggested by that pharmaceutical representative. So it gives the appearance, and this is an important distinction, appearance of a conflict of interest. And so the article is there. I'll refer to it a couple of times. So you can read it at your leisure. And if you want to read the entire thing, you can Google it. The whole thing is reported in Google and available there. As Eduardo mentioned, I've only recently become interested in the necessity to apply what we study in philosophy and ethical theories to real issues. And so last year's conference was an inspiration to me, because I realized from the business people who were here that this is very important, that we have to, the rubber has to hit the road, as they say, and we have to do something with what we do in our, as Bill McVeigh has said, in our sandbox, in our little ivory tower. And that's a great image as well, a great metaphor. So the article then is about gifts to doctors, and you'll notice here at the end when they speak of the results, you have the abstract there in the handout. When they speak of the results, it's the they use the word association, and the more typical word is correlation. And so here we have a logical topic, I guess we say, because all of us who have studied logic, and I'm sure everyone at some point realizes that there are such things as fallacies, right? Flawed arguments, arguments that go wrong, bastard arguments. And one of the classic arguments that is a fallacy is, of course, has several names. I call it the false cause, that 2 phenomena occur at the same time. So one is always tempted to say that one is the cause of the other. So all we can say is there is a correlation, and we're tempted always, something in us intuitively perhaps wants to say, well, it has to be connected in some way. There are too many cases where they're correlated. And so in the literature, what they do then is make the distinction between a genuine conflict of interest and one that is apparent. And so that's what the article says. It uses that very careful vocabulary of association, and we would say correlation as well. So we also have then, if you like to follow along on the slides, you have then an outline of what I propose for your consideration today. First thing I'd give, of course, are examples of this professional relationship, and we're all familiar with these. So you see there, the doctor and his patient. The relationship between them is a very special relationship, and we've all been to doctors, and so we know how almost sacred that relationship is. And the same thing with lawyers, and lawyer and his client, the accountant, the engineer and his client, and of course one that strikes home to some of us in particular, the teacher and his student. That's one that's very close to our hearts, of course. So this relationship then is created, all right? This relationship is created based on the body of knowledge that the professional has acquired. So the professional, one of the first characteristics of what we want to call a professional is that he is versed and educated in a very identifiable body of knowledge, and that he has experience and education and credentials or licensing in that area. Now, we also have then a person. I'm calling the professional P and the client C, just for the sake of brevity. So the professional, or P, has knowledge and experience, and C, the client, comes to him with a need of some kind and asks for his help. So the client goes to the lawyer, the patient goes to the doctor, the student registers at the college or the school, and so on. They are in need of something. And the professional freely commits himself to addressing the question or the needs or the disabilities or whatever the problem may be, the interest. So I'm going to use the catch-all word interest. The client has specific interest, and the professional is the one who has the body of knowledge, who is willing and able to commit himself to addressing the interest of the client. And in return, and here's the basis of the relationship, very special relationship, the client trusts that the professional will do as he has promised, that he, the professional, will address the client's best interest. Now, what makes this relationship special, or certainly identifiable, not an ordinary contractual relationship, that it's not based on the laws of contract. It's based on the trust that now exists between them. So the authority for what the professional does is vested in the trust that the client has given him. And now the professional has an ethical obligation to address the special interests of the client. Now, what that term's best interests mean, and that's in the literature as well, best interests, points out the idea, the reality that there are limitations, or I should say boundaries to because the professional has other obligations as well. What would be some of these obligations? Well, obviously he's bound by statute, law, requirements, community regulations, and so on. And so the person, the client might wish a building built, and the engineer, structural engineer, then has to obey all the building codes of the community. Excuse me. And if it's in an earthquake area, there are even more requirements that the professional has. Now, he does this even though the client might not want him to do that. The client might resent that extra work, that extra expense, but the professional is bound to do it. And so that's an obligation that the professional has with no discussion. He simply has to do it. And so you have things like building codes. We have, and this is a favorite in Rhode Island. Rhode Island is beset with environmental restrictions. And for example, a colleague of mine at Solvay bought a property in Tiverton, Rhode Island, and it was a 40-acre property, and that's quite a big piece of land in little Rhode Island. And yet he could use and have access really and build on and do things with only about 1/3 of that property, because it was mostly wetlands, and he was not informed. He wasn't aware. I guess he was informed, but he wasn't especially aware. After all, he's a philosopher. What does he know about wetlands, right? Right. So he was, he learned pretty soon that no, you can't build there. You can't put a little boathouse on that little lake that's in the middle of your property, because that's wetlands. After all, those little frogs and all those beautiful cattails have the right to life. You can't put anything on them and destroy them in that way. And so obviously there are environmental restrictions on the professional. Again, the client might not want this, but the professional has no choice. So this is a real boundary. Picking on the auditor, let's say a company hires an auditing some auditors and pays them lots of money to be auditors, and yet the auditor is required to be honest about the well-being of the company. And so the auditors are in a difficult position. They are in a potential conflict of interest, because they're being paid by people whom they may say are disobeying the law or are not doing something right. And we all remember Enron and all the problems they're in. And so the auditors then are another example of the boundaries. After all, the auditor will not want to give bad news to the company that has hired him, because they might not hire them again, and so the problem exists. So that's one of the obligations, other obligations other than the best interests of the client. Then secondly, as an obligation to his family, to himself, to his income. And what is enough? Well, whatever the market will bear, whatever the reasonable person in that situation would require or expect. And of course, if one is a doctor, a lawyer, and professionals, there is a range of income that the professional get, and it's a market-driven thing. And It's open to scrutiny, I suspect. And so if you're a professor at Salve Regina in Newport, you certainly don't get paid what a professor at Harvard University is paid, but that's reasonable and it's almost expected. And so it's a reasonable level of income for himself and his family. But it is an obligation that he must maintain. He's not doing this pro bono. He is doing this as a career and as a profession to support himself. He also has, thirdly, he also has obligations to his profession. He cannot be a bad example of an engineer who consistently makes mistakes, or a lawyer who consistently gets himself into trouble, or a teacher who doesn't do whatever all the things that teachers are expected to do. And so, for example, even though one is a professor and one is tenured, there are requirements, expectations spelled out by the AAUP, American Association of University Professors, about what is acceptable, and the codes are there. And that's another characteristic. Each of the professions has an identifiable code, guidelines or principles that the person in that profession is expected to abide by. And so one can lose one's tenure for reasons. I think the current language is still the traditional language of insanity and moral turpitude. So if you see any examples or instances of insanity or moral turpitude in your friendly local professor, you'll know that the poor soul is in trouble. So he has the reputation of his organization, of his profession, and he should try to arrange so that there is no intrusion in the profession. And here we have the phenomenon of government or statute oversight and intrusion, which of course ought to be avoided, but sometimes is indeed unavoidable. But it would be ideal if the professions could monitor themselves with their ethical codes and not invite government or state intrusion into the mix. And lastly, under other obligations, I want to highlight the word best. The word best interest then means this, that the professional knows more about what the client needs than the client may know. And so let's say that the person has seen all these ads for pharmaceuticals on television, the kind that constantly bombard you about buy this and this is good for you, lose 10 pounds in a month and 5 inches overall and so on, all of these wonderful enticing ads. And then of course they always give warnings at the end, don't they? All right, so it may induce brain tumors, thoughts of suicide. See if it's all right for you. Check with your doctor. And so it raises all kinds of questions. And in one sense, they're dangerous and they're funny, and yet they're funny. And so there you have it. And so let's say the person has seen all these ads and he goes to his doctor now. Let's say the lady goes to her doctor and says, I have to lose 10 pounds, and Nutrisystem promises that I'll lose 10 pounds in a month. And the doctor will certainly know more about it than the patient will. And so the best interests of the client then, only the professional really knows the best interest because of the fact that he has the background and the education that the client doesn't have. If the client had the same level of expertise, he or she would not have to consult the professional in the first place. So it's the best interests of the client, even though the client may be dragged kicking and screaming into it. And so that's the challenge, to maintain the trust that is the authority of the relationship without disappointing the client unnecessarily or violating his expectations. So the professional has a real responsibility. And what is responsibility? I think we all know, so let me just go briefly through that. The classic instance, the Locus Classicus, is the third book of the Nicomachean Ethics. And there Aristotle offers 3 criteria for personal responsibility. So if I pass out a paper and give you a quiz, can you all list those 3 criteria? All right. Sufficient knowledge. Knowledge that is sufficient for accomplishing the task. All right. That goes without saying. The professional has that. He has more than sufficient. He is supposedly an expert, is well qualified in his area. He's a doctor, he's a lawyer, he's an engineer, and so on. Secondly, he or she is free from coercion. He's operating freely. And of course, remember that historically Aristotle is seeking to resist any remnants of fatalism that might still be around in Athens. So freedom is important, that one achieves one's own goals by one's free choices. And then lastly, sufficient deliberation. One thinks about it. All right, so those are the 3 criteria that he offers in the course of that book. And each of those is a necessary condition of responsibility, but no one of them is sufficient. When taken together, they become sufficient. So responsibility then is a blend of all of those conditions. And it's not a matter of black and white either. It's a continuum, a range of responsibility. And we see it played out as it was developed in our Western history. We see it even in, let's say, the laws about surrounding murder, the difference between manslaughter and first-degree murder and so on. They all are built on those basic criteria of the Nicomachean ethics. And then, of course, each of the professions, as you know, publishes its ethical code. So I've begun personally collecting some of these ethical codes. As far as I know, all of them are online. And I often wonder how we learned anything before there was the internet. I don't know, we must have been in the dark ages somehow or other, but everything seems to be available, and I love it dearly. And so the codes are all there. And the most sophisticated that I've seen so far, by the way, if you know any social workers, are the social workers' ethical codes. They're very detailed. And so the lawyers have theirs, the engineers have theirs. In fact, each of the areas of engineering have their own code. There's a basic similarity, but there are individual differences depending on their area of expertise. Let's say the electrical engineer has some differences between himself and the mechanical engineer and so on, as you'd expect. However, that being said, differences being acknowledged, nonetheless, every single one of them specifies conflict of interest as an ethical obligation that the professional has to avoid. So let's move on to conflict of interest. I took this definition, it's a good working definition, from an engineering text, and you have it there spelled out. The print is too small, perhaps, but anyway, you'll get the idea. I'm sorry it's small, I had trouble with my little printer. All right, so there are two sections to it. Let me read them, it's very quick. P has a conflict of interest if and only if, 1, P is in a relationship with another, requiring P to exercise judgment in the other's behalf. Now, this is a working definition. It has to be spelled out. It has to be tweaked a bit. All right, and we'll do a little bit of that. And then secondly, P has a special interest tending to interfere with the proper exercise of judgment in that relationship. All right, so moving ahead. Let's get in one more. Okay. What do we mean by a special interest? When is it a special interest? That's a generic word that we find in the literature, meaning any other interest other than that of his client that may be tempting to him, like profit, for example, or connections, or something that would enhance his own wants, his own needs, those of his friends, and so on. So something that's special to him and might not be in the best interest of his client. And if the client were to find out about it, would be very disappointed in the professional. One that's discussed, let me give you a more personal example. An example that, when I say personal, that is up for discussion, I think, among faculty members generally, and it has to do with grade inflation. You've all heard of that, grade inflation. People getting A's and B's who probably don't deserve them. And the students sometimes, when they get the A, of course, maybe, of course, elated that they got the A, but when they go to take, apply to grad school or take the go to grad school, apply to grad school, apply to law school, they discover that, well, I wasn't accepted. Why was I not accepted? And it might not even be racism. It might not even be that. It might simply be that the university or the law school has a certain, holds that college in a certain reputation, because we know admissions offices in colleges and in graduate schools have some idea of the university or the high school that from which they draw students or tend to draw students. So they do study the school, and they have a school, the schools build up a reputation. I was startled to learn this recently, but the admissions office people say this is the truth, and we have tried to study the schools from which our students come so that we know how to interpret the transcript, because an A on a transcript in one school is not equal to an A in another school, and so there is a clear indication of grade inflation. And when we look at the scores of American students compared with scores of students in other countries, we see that we are not at the top of the list in any of the lists for any of the subjects. And so with all the students getting A's and we're so far down on the list, obviously there's some grade inflation going on. Now, here is one of the correlations that people talk about. I won't name the people, but we talk about it, okay? There seems to be an association, or as they say, or a correlation between grade inflation and asking students to evaluate their professors and using those evaluations as part of the rank of the promotion and tenuring process. All right, so a professor wants to hold on to his job. That's reasonable. And how is he going to? He will hold on to his job if he is tenured. How will he get tenure? Well, an important consideration, not the only one obviously, but an important consideration is how successful is he as a teacher in the classroom? He may be a world-class scholar, but how is he before 30 students who may or may not like what he has to say? How does he measure up there? And so if he gets good evaluations, if he gives A's, he will tend to get better evaluations. If he gives C's and D's, as maybe they deserve, he will not get good evaluations. Is this a conflict of interest? No one knows. But again, as the Medical Association points out, there are so many instances of it that it certainly has to be looked at or thought about and maybe studied if in some way we could get at that information, that there is an association. And we know that association or correlation is not cause and effect. We know that. We've been taught that years ago in logic, but nonetheless, we still see it all around us, don't we? We know, for example, newspapers will tell us that things like, excuse me, poverty is the cause of crime. Terrific. Poverty is the cause of crime. What about poor people who don't commit crime? What about rich people who do? Well, those are outliers. We don't concern ourselves with them. So nonetheless, this is a gospel item in the media, I think it's safe to say. Do you think you've heard this before, poverty is the cause of crime, so what do? Well, we put up a gymnasium and they play basketball. So some 18-year-old character who wants a nice, fast car and still say, well, I won't steal a car tonight, I'll go and play basketball, as if that were, part of the ordinary reasoning process. So there is a special interest. There is what could qualify as a special interest. And then, of course, back to the American Medical Association's example, a doctor gets a gift from a pharmaceutical rep. Is this going to influence the decision that he makes about prescriptions? It may do so. It's an apparent thing. As they say in politics now, the optics are not good. And you'll notice how careful the article is if you look through it. To say the doctor's not doing anything wrong, it's just that there's an appearance that there's a possibility, carefully crafted language. All right. Is this a dilemma? Not really. I think I need to say, this is no ordinary dilemma. In a dilemma, it follows typically two paths, if you recall. We have course of action A and course of action B. And A, that we look and envision the consequences of A, and we look at B and the consequences of B, and the consequences pretty much balance out. We have a dilemma, all right? Or it might be that we're not utilitarians, we're guided by principles or guidelines. So here we have the principle, let's say, of charity, and here we have the principle of honesty. They're both wonderful, perfect, wonderful, first-rate principles and guidelines, but sometimes in a real situation, they might give contrary advice, right? Let me give you an example, all right. Your mother, your wife, someone who's very dear to you, is going to a special event, big wedding in the family, and she wants a new outfit, a new dress, a real nice dress. So she goes down to Nordstrom's, and she pays, let's say, $300 for a dress. This is Nordstrom's after all. And she's so happy. She's over the moon about this $300 dress. Now she comes home, and she puts it on, shows it to you, and says, do you like my dress? And you don't like it. For whatever reason, you don't like it. Now, the principle of charity, what does the principle of charity ask you to do there? Anyone want to volunteer an answer? Hypothetical answer? Principle of charity now, a regard for the person, an affirmation of the person. What are you going to do? Principle of charity. Lie. Lie like a trooper. Lie like a trooper. All right. That is a wonder. Now, if you're male, probably you can get away with it by saying, oh, gee, Ma, what do a man know about women's dresses? Give me a break, but a female can't get away with that. You have to give her a genuine answer. You can't discard the question that easily. On the other hand, what would the principle of honesty require? I don't like it. I'm sorry. I know you paid big bucks for it at Nordstrom, but this, I really don't like it. And each of those has advantages, because if you're telling the truth, she won't be tempted to, she might want to return it, actually, because she values your opinion. She wants affirmation, and she wants, God bless you, your affirmation. And so if you tell her the truth, she won't buy such an outfit again, most likely. All right. On the other hand, the principle of charity has its advantage, because she makes her feel good. She feels good about herself at a time maybe when she needs to feel good, and she's looking forward to the celebration. And so you've done her a good turn. All right. That is a dilemma also. Now, how is this not a dilemma? It's more like, I want to say, built on the trust of the person, and the trust requires that the professional, consider only the best interests of the person. And so because it's built on trust, it's not built on consequences, it's not built on obedience or deference to principles. It's built solely on the trust that the client has invested in him. And I'm going to say a word in a minute about lying, because the notion of lying has an analogy here, is in an analogical situation here. So the best interest then, regardless of whether he or the client wants it or not. So it's not a dilemma. It's not an ordinary dilemma, because it is based on trust and not on consequences and not on principles. It's based solely on that very special relationship. And so you might want to, I haven't worked out the logic of it, but I think if it's not a dilemma, maybe you'd want to argue that it's a subset or a special case of a dilemma. So that deserves some discussion. I'm not too sure of whether it's a subset of dilemma or it's completely different from dilemma. So if you have any ideas, maybe we can hash that out. Now you also see proper exercise in the definition here. Tending to interfere with the proper exercise of judgment in that relationship. The word judgment here does not refer to the content of what he says. It refers rather to the action that he takes. Now, the analogy here is that what's the word? I guess lying here is the best analogy that I've thought of so far. So let me tell you what I think here. It's possible to tell the truth, say something that's true, and still lie, because it refers not to the content of what is said, but rather to the intention. And so it's the intention of the professional that matters here. That's what judgment means. It means his intention is good. It serves the best interests of the client, even though there may be mistakes in the content. So there may be, for example, the engineer may make a mistake in this calculation, and those glass walls in the John Hancock Tower in Boston might fall down on the street below, or a walkway inside a building may fall down, and so on. So calculation errors, for example, or honest errors, so to speak, of content are not moral failings. They're simple knowledge or calculation errors. So that doesn't demean his judgment. Judgment here refers to the trust that he has taken on board here. His intention is to serve the client. And again, being human, fallible, he might make a mistake in that regard. Now, there are boundaries to the relationship. I've already referred to some of these. He cannot do anything illegal. That goes without saying. He has to remain current in his professional obligations. And that, of course, is a constant challenge, because every body of knowledge is growing. And there will be changing legislation and expectations, community concerns, oversight, and so he has to be aware of all of those. And it's a boundary to what he's doing, and the client, of course, may not wish this, but again, the client has no say in this. The professional is bound not only to the best interests of the client, but also to the community's expectations and laws. And secondly, he has to stay, this has to do with the boundaries again, he has to stay within the body of knowledge of which he is an expert. He has to acknowledge the limitations of what he knows, and of course his licensing. Some professions have licenses, and this is a point that the social workers code takes very seriously, that their license can be removed for certain naughties that they may perform. And then of course, lastly, as we know, has to remain current in the development of his profession. How are we doing so far? Let's do this. The last one here is obligation extends farther. This one here. Then C may realize. I want to use Kant's practical imperative as a way of understanding this. If you recall, Kant says in the practical imperative, in short, that we are to treat human beings as ends in themselves and never as means to an end, the so-called humanity or practical imperative. And so the professional then is treating the client and his best interest as an end in himself. If it were otherwise, he would be treating him as a means to an end. So if I want to make money on this deal, so to speak, then as a professional, then I will be treating the client, my student, whatever, as a means to an end. I will be violating Kant's practical imperative. So it is one application of the practical imperative that I think helps us out at this to understand or explore the relationship between the professional and his client. So what do the various codes that I alluded to, what do they advise? Well, it's pretty bold and pretty simple in the last slide there. First of all, the actions avoid conflict of interest, as you'd expect, whenever possible. So here the professional has to envision what is possible and then recuse himself, ideally, this is the ideal that the code spells out now, ought to recuse himself completely and then ask the client to go elsewhere if he needs be. But of course, if he's a source of income, this is always, again, it could be a hard thing to do. What about apparent conflict of interest? Again, the codes generally are in agreement, avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest, an apparent conflict of interest. Again, this requires great determination and strong will in the professional, because as a human being, of course, he will be drawn to do otherwise. He may be drawn to do otherwise. And lastly, to inform all, as they say, stakeholders who could possibly have an interest in this. So let's say the engineer has to build a building, but he works for a company, so is an obligation not only to the client, who has hired the company. He works for the company, and the company again becomes a stakeholder. So it's the client as well as the company itself for which he works. So I'm asking you now, in light of that, to look at the first question I have on the paper there. How can group responsibility be understood? This is a challenge in philosophy as much as anywhere, because our understanding of responsibility has been defined in terms of the individual person. It has not been defined in terms of group decisions. And since we are interested in groups like corporations and businesses and so on, group responsibility has to be worked out analytically, as if we can, as well as Aristotle worked out personal responsibility. And so I ask you, if you recall, if you're old enough to remember 1986, the Challenger disaster, how is that relevant? Remember the Challenger disaster, anyone?
Quality control. Yeah, that was an O-ring or something?
Yes, all right, yes, the O-rings, the infamous O-rings. They were bands that were placed, well, the rocket boosters, you have the central tank, which has liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Then you have the rocket boosters, which have hard fuel or other chemicals and nitrates and so on. But the rocket boosters are assembled in sections. And at the juncture of those sections, there are O-rings. Now, those are those are strong rubber. And the purpose is to help prevent any gas or fumes coming out from the rocket boosters. But this is only a temporary thing, because as soon as the shuttle itself gets up to high enough and where it's supposed to be, the rocket boosters all fall away and fall into the ocean, and they're retrieved and reused, refurbished if possible, and reused again. And so the O-rings have to work for just a small length of time. Now the structural engineers, and the company was Morton Thiokol. Morton Thiokol hired a team of had engineers, of course, on staff, and the engineers had quantified all of the elements of the design, but they were not sure about how to quantify the rate of degradation of the O-rings. Because one of the factors there that threw off their traditional or their usual calculations was the fact that the temperatures there in Florida had been unusually cold. And that morning, the temperatures ranged between 30 and 38 degrees. For Florida, that's very low. And to complicate the matter, the blast-off had been scheduled for January 20th, and this was now the 28th. And as we say, the optics were not good. NASA was all bent out of shape because Krista McAuliffe, a teacher, was on board for the first time, and everyone was paying attention to this episode, and everyone was watching it. And so they wanted the blast-off to take place as soon as possible. So NASA was putting pressure on Morton Thiokol. Thiokol management was putting pressure on the engineers. So the engineers very honestly said, we cannot quantify the rate of degradation given those low temperatures. Our usual equations don't work because of the low temperatures. And not only was it cold that morning, it had been cold ever since January 20th. And so all bets are off, as they say, with regard to quantifying the rate of degradation. And so they said, we're not sure. So that's all management needed. They went ahead and said, well, forget about the engineers. We're going to go ahead and tell NASA we're ready for launch. And so they launched, and you know what happened in a few seconds, so just a little bit over a minute. The O-rings stiffened and were unable to adhere and do their job. And so the gas escaped. It set off the central tank of hydrogen and oxygen. And you can imagine, well, you've seen it, perhaps the films that resulted in it. So the question is, who was responsible for it? You have different elements. You have NASA, you have Morton Thiokol, you have the engineers. All right, you have a group of people, a fairly large group of people. Now, somebody is responsible for that, but how do we allocate, shall I say, degrees of responsibility when there is a group decision? And it doesn't have to be as dramatic as a launch disaster. It can be a simple decision in a company. Some person puts a little suggestion in a suggestion box. It moves up the hierarchy. And finally, the CEO and the treasurer and the bursar, everyone has a part in the decision. Now, who's responsible for that decision? Now, of course, if it's a good decision, everybody takes credit for it. But remember the old saying, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. All right, so if it's a failure, whom do we blame? Do we blame the poor bloke who put the suggestion in the box and forgot about it? Or do we blame the CEO? Do we blame the trustees? Do we blame the bursar who paid the bills? And all right, so we don't know. So there's a challenge there to work out a notion of group responsibility if we can. And I think that's the one question, although that wasn't my initial question, I think that's the large question that you and I are left with. My initial question was, my point in starting it was to think about the idea, try to work out the idea that a conflict of interest is a special ethical obligation of a professional. All right, conflict of interest is a special ethical obligation, to avoid it, obviously, of a professional. And now, I think that's true enough, it's reasonable to say that, but I think now we're left with a larger question of trying to understand group responsibility. Now, with regard to the ethical codes, all the professions have worked out their own ethical codes, but how are they to be enforced? In many cases, I think most, I asked a local group of electrical engineers, Providence section, IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, about the enforcement of it, and they say, we really don't enforce it. We have no means of enforcing it. And so if they're fairly representative, in other words, if that's true of them and others as well, these are just words in a booklet somewhere, and they don't perhaps mean anything. It's left to the conscience of the individual professional to abide by them. But maybe they shouldn't be enforced. Maybe you can't enforce morality, because this is not law now. This is ethics. And I don't want to get into the discussion of the distinction between morality and ethics right now, but you understand what I'm saying. It's not a matter of law. It's a matter of conscience for the individual professional. So should it be enforced, or can it be enforced? Is this just impossible to enforce? We have to leave it to the conscience of the person. I don't know. So I leave you with that question in any case, all right? Can I ask? One more little point before I turn over to Eduardo again. I wanted to find out where was the first code, if there was any such thing. Professional codes are a creature of the 20th century, I know that. But were there any predecessors? And so I found one. I'll read that one sentence from this code and see if you can identify it, all right? If a builder build a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built fall in and kill its owner, then that builder shall be put to death.
The Old Testament.
No.
Or never.
Exactly. Perfect. Right. A+, Terry. Okay.
Thank you so very much. Well, continuing with our plenary session 4, which is about the activities and responsibilities of leadership. We will now listen to, and let's see if I can pronounce it correctly, Friar Thomas Kopiczko. Is that any good? Who will talk about the apostolic activity of a leader in the church. He is from the Elk Seminary of Warmia and Masaryk University in Poland. So let us give a warm welcome to Friar Thomas.
It is important to see.
Everybody can see that, all right?
Okay. So sorry for my English, but I try to say something correct. Our subject is the apostolic activity of a leader in the church, or leader formation in the church, I could say. As you remember, last year we had our hero, Little John. But today, John is growing up and starting to thinking. So let's go. The questions for today is, how can we create a leader in the church? Before we will starting, we have a question. What is the difference between a boss and a leader? Do you know the answer? The answer is, boss says go and leader says let's go. Or the same situation we can see here. Here we have boss and here we have leader, the first position. Okay, so let's back to our question. How can we create a leader in the church? So I would like to explain my paper in 4 points. The method of Jesus, example of a disciple, modern application of a method of Jesus, and the end conclusion. This presentation is reflection combining pastoral, theological, catechetical, and pedagogical aspects. But I think that it will be theological, not philosophical, like your presentation. First of all, the word leader is from English, as you know well. To lead means to guide, conduce, direct, or pursue. Yes. Leader, this word in original scientific meaning, it means a leader of a group or a leadership. Currently, leader is a person whose authority allows him to influence a group. Or according to some other authors, leader is not only a person, but also the way in which the leadership authority is executed within a group. We can say that a leader is a head in workplace, a manager, supervisor, president of an association, or a chief of the trade union. We know that a leader of, we can say the leader of a political party, leader of a community, of a regional or town, leader in an economic sense, leader in a construction industry, leader of a particular social group. But for us today, a leader is a guide, a teacher, or a caretaker. We are interested in a leader in the church community. So we can say that the role and presence of a leader in the church community is important, since its members are obliged to develop at all times. They must deepen their faith and relationship with God. So they need a leader for do this job. And first point, the method of Jesus. And from the very beginning, his greatest concern was to create a cycle of regular disciples. But in the beginning, we have to know that formation for what? For proclaiming love and peace. So we have, first of all, we have to have person, then there's process of formation, we have leader for what? For proclaiming love and peace. We can say that his law is love and his gospel is peace. We can find many different places in gospel where we can read about love, where Jesus teach about love. Is gospel according Mark, and about peace, gospel about Matthew. Blessed are the proclaim peacemakers, for they shall be called the child of God. I think that in gospel, first of all, peace in your heart, then peace in your family, with your friends, and then peace in the whole world. I think that we could say a lot of things, interesting things about peace in gospel, but in my presentation I would like to say more about formation. So we have to remember that after 3 years of formation of his disciples, in the moment of crucifixion, we can say that Jesus failed because he was alone in the end, yes? But in the moment of Pentecost, he succeeded because he wasn't alone. There were 11 or 12 apostles and the Holy Spirit, yes? And then they go out throughout the world. What we can say about the method of Jesus? Jesus, being a leader himself, undertakes the formation of future leaders. The relationship between disciples and the master was much different from what we understand today. It cannot be compared by means to the relationship between university professor and students nowadays. Jesus' activity sets an example for us as well. His efforts were focused on 72 disciples, out of which 12 or 11 became master or leader. His intention was that every disciple would become a master in the future. After completing the formation, the apostle of Jesus became the master of others. We can see it that first of all we have Jesus and then 11 or 12 disciples, yes, and then we have next generation of leaders. We arrived to nowadays in this way. Next point is the 8 points of the method of Jesus, typical points of this formation. So the first point is posing question. Several times he posed questions to make them think and then find the answer. Jesus don't want to give the answer without thinking. First of all, you have to think and you have to find answer. The next point is repetition. In some parts of the gospel, he used the 3 different parables to explain the mystery of the kingdom of the heaven. The next point is pictures and signs. Teaching through symbols was the method which was effective and easy to remember. When people look at the flowers or birds, they remembered his parables. Setting examples. Jesus taught through example more than through words. And Jose Prato Flores notes that the most important task for the master was not to set up a university, but a laboratory in which people would be able to put his teaching into practice. Next point is selecting a group of disciples. It means that not everyone could be disciple of Jesus. The disciple have a unique position in his project. During the 3 years of his activity, we can spot that he explaining them everything in private, got into the boat with his disciples, he celebrated Passover with them, washed their feet, and many other things, yes? Next point is a book to read. It is interesting that Jesus didn't use a library with book in all possible languages, but he taught them to read the surrounding world. The best school is life. The classes were not held in the front of the board, but were in the real life situation. And the most important part of the formation was that his disciples were to become like him. Now we should go outside, yes? But here we have air conditions, so it is better stay here. Child as a model. The disciple was not a student from a rabbin college in Jerusalem, but a child that trusts his father and belonged to him. So, the method of Jesus, in a few words, we can say no answer, but think and then find the answers. No school, but laboratory. No theory, but practice. No classes, but real situation. No book, but the word. Not one time, but repetition. And not everyone, but selecting. Now we have the second point. Example of a disciple. As we know, Jesus chose a group of leaders, and the only condition was to be authentic disciples. And who is disciples? Example of disciples, we can say that disciples tries to be like his teacher. He receives the instruction from the master. Disciples is part of Jesus' family. Disciples is poor in spirit. And in the end, the disciples is formed for proclaiming love and peace. There's something special. There's special relation between Jesus, who is master's leader, and apostles. But we have to remember that they are human people, person, so they are not perfect. So human imperfections are filled with the grace of the Holy Spirit in this moment of formation, yes. And now we have the last point, modern application of Jesus' method. We have three different, there are plenty of examples for leader formation in the Catholic Church nowadays, but my choice was these three reality because priests, because I'm working in seminary, catechists, because I teach cateches in seminary, and evangelizers because I'm interested in evangelization. So my choice is this. The first, formation of clergymen. This is building of our seminary in Ełk, where I live. We can say that nowadays the whole formation of clergymen consists of four parallel elements: human formation, spiritual formation, intellectual formation, and pastoral formation. And that's all for proclaiming love and peace. But the most important, I think, that is human formation. We can see it that education should have the following course. We have to do construction, yes? So in the beginning, we have to be human being, yes? Later, Christian, later clergyman, and the end, leader of the community in the church. But first of all, we have to be human, yes? So the most important is human formation. The characteristic of a well-formed priest, it's very interesting, but we can say that knowledge and understanding of himself, the ability to build interpersonal relation and to cooperate with others, and many others. Finally, to be like apostles, or to be like Jesus Christ, good shepherd. Yes, I think that is most important. Formation of catechists. We can say that catechist is a leader of a community, the teacher of the faith, educator, the animators of communication, and partners in dialogue. I think that we can say many interesting things about formation of catechists, but in three words, we can say that the catechist should be able to be present, to know what to do, and to be able to do it. Of course, for proclaiming love and peace. Now I would like to give you an example. Maybe you know Jan Szkorczak, the pen name of Henryk Goldschmidt. It was a Polish Jewish educator, and after spending many years working as a director of an orphanage in Warsaw, he refused freedom and was sent from the ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp with children from this orphanage. And one day he wrote, "We give you nothing. We don't give God because you must seek Him in your soul. We don't give you man's love because there is no love without condemnation. We give you one thing, longing for better life, which is absent, but one day will be. longing for the life of truth and fairness. The longing will guide you to God, homeland, and love. So we can say that in his life we have to proclaiming love and peace, which means believing in the possibilities and the potential of man and being a guide for them. And in the end, formation of evangelizers. The formation of new evangelizers for a new evangelization is an integral formation comprising the whole man. We can say that the basic skills in this context include the ability to form teams, being clear, asking questions and listening, learning from mistakes, and creativity and flexibility. Unfortunately, it isn't easy. And formation of evangelizers, especially we can often we can hear that we need for new evangelization we need the new forms, yes, but I think that it means that the leader or evangelizer should have interpersonal communication skills and should use the latest technologies. For what? For proclaiming love and peace, yes. And conclusion, what should be done? I think that a perfect leader example created by Jesus is still up to date. A clergyman, an evangelizer, and a catechist should always, first of all, have a deep relation with God, be dynamic and in action, be ready to serve, and still for proclaiming love and peace. And in the end of my presentation, I'd like to show something interesting. I think that we can recognize this place. It's St. Peter's Square, Rome. And here, in this part, in the center, we have Jesus, yes. And there are Peter and Paul, two pillars of Jesus' church. But it is interesting, however, next to Peter, we can see his brother Andrew, who called him and was brought to Jesus. And behind Paul stands Annas, yes? He found Paul, prayed for him, healed him, filled with the Holy Spirit. So, there is no Peter without Andrew, and no Paul without Annas. And in these details, there is a great apostolic secret, the formation of disciples, readers, and guides, that everyone needs leaders in his life. Now, question for us all, finding the treasure of new life in Jesus Christ is the greatest joy possible. It's true? There is yet something greater. It is being a leader to help others find it. The greatest joy is not to be a Jesus disciple, but to create disciples of the only Master. Wow. And thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. So now we would like to open the room for a discussion. So if you have any questions, we have around 20-25 minutes for discussion. Should we turn this around?
I have a question.
on leadership. As far as I can tell, and I think today most New Testament scholars would agree with me, on the historical Jesus from the Gospels, we really can't know much. In that sense, that's become clear since the days of Spicer, trying to back the historical Jesus. I mean, the Jesus we know is the Jesus after the resurrection that comes from the church. But the historical Jesus was clear how he taught. He was fundamentally a physician, a healer. He healed pain. And that's what he was teaching his apostles. The apostles kept saying, when can we heal? When can we be doctors? When can we relieve people's pain? This was the fundamental purpose of Jesus' teaching, that he came to take away our pain. So much so, as a teacher, he has to carry the lesson himself, right at the end. He doesn't really, even in his life, get the answer to it. That's the guard. So, in pain is the ultimate failure as the physician. The answer comes in the resurrection. And so the big part of leadership, since we spoke of the historical Jesus, is the elimination of pain in the world. That people suffer. The existential situation of human suffering. So we teach people to lead is to heal pain. So the presentation is right, but in a sense there's something incomplete in that concept of pain. It's not in there. Secondly, the leadership of the church, a lot of that is defined in the post-resurrection church with Paul. And the leadership there is not so much leadership, it's what the church does. It creates this powerful community, this community of love, of friendship, which we get to see hints of even in the New Testament of Jesus. You know, I call you my friends. This is the greatest honor I can give. So the church elevates in the street culture, Roman culture, this concept of friendship and community to this incredible love. And that becomes very important in the Roman society, in the Greek society. Because you have a society where you are protected when you join a guild. This is where you're a community, like a community center. And it's very expensive to join these guilds. And now the church begins to give you a new type of guild based on a resurrection, a new type of sense of community, one based on love and so forth. Where the poor man and the rich man all have to lay on the table. You all become, through baptism, in Christ. So and from after that community is established and the concepts of leadership begin to break up. And then the gifts of the Spirit begin to develop. Some are called to be preachers, some are called to be teachers, and so forth. So I think a lot of the concept of leadership in the church has to be seen in the historical Jesus and the concept of the resurrection church. The church is defined, and much of the definition of the church and leadership comes from Paul. The other thing, the concept of friendship becomes very important because now friendship in a very hostile world, especially if you're traveling, gives you a great deal of protection and support. I'm saying that in what word was giving a talk the other day, the threshing floor in the world, okay? And what the new Christian community does, it insulates you and protects you from that. And just like the people rushing from the Muslim world into the Western shores of Christianity, the answer should be, if you want freedom, don't expect it from government. Join the Christian community. That would be the kind of leadership that we would bring to the world. The solution to pain eventually is not just embracing of Christ and welcoming it into his community. Now, I'm not so sure that's the leadership that we have. That's my only comment. I'm not saying your presentation was wrong, but I think there's a certain incompleteness in it.
I wanted to move the conversation in relation to both papers toward St. Thomas's understanding of a leader, and ask I noticed both of you talked about relationships in the papers, and informing relationships. St. Thomas has this comment in on unity of the intellect against the avaricious, where he talks about the responsibility of a professional, and he says it extends as far as the limits of the genus. I think that's the limits of it, or the end of the genus, but I'm pretty sure it says the limits of the genus, which means that he understands responsibility to exist only within a genus, which would be the profession in this situation. And so what the question I have for both is whether leadership can exist at all if you can't form a genus. Is it the case that what a leader first has to do is to form a genus with an other in some way or other before the relationship can be established? Because leadership presupposes being able to relate a plurality. And if you can't relate to plurality, you can't establish the leadership-led relationship. So how do you establish that? Is that the case? First of all, is that the case that leadership only takes place within a genus or an organization? And if you can't establish some sort of an organization right off the bat, can you have a leadership relationship?
It would seem so because of the growth of our professions. Various professions would constitute, I think, in those terms, a genus. And the body of knowledge grows, and historically there's an evolution of increasingly more professions, and so human ability, there is a definite human ability to form such a community or a genus. So it would seem to be, yes, that it's necessary within that genus. If one is an accountant, one cannot provide medication, and so there's a definite community structure there. That's what he means by genus then?
Yes, basically an operational organization.
It would seem that the body of knowledge creates its own organization.
So outside of an organization, you really can't have leadership. And the first act of a leader, to some extent, is to establish that there's an organization here, to order the St. Thomas would say.
Yes.
You're making my point. This is what Paul says, the Acts of the Apostles. He forms the church, which is the genus. Okay? The church doesn't exist until Acts of the Apostles.
So the other question is, do relationships exist only within genera? Or do they exist also between genera? And if they exist between genera, how do they exist?
Well, not for Paul.
For anybody.
So they exist logically between genera. So.
Okay, but now does it exist within a wider genus?
I'd say it's really analogical, not really wider genus. So,
Or more extensive? If you have a relationship between two organizations, they'd have to share something in common,
right.
which would put them into another genus.
I'm not sure about that.
Well, I would say yes, because at breakfast we were discussing the effects of this Brexit decision about England and the European Union. And I can see that the leadership within these respective countries, within these organizations, it affects other organizations. I mean, we were affected here in the United States. I would say yes.
Because the reason I'm asking is because St. Thomas talks about four kinds of opposites: privation of possession, relation, contradiction, contrariety. And you can't have a relationship between contradictories because one doesn't exist. Right. So, contrariety and relation are instances of privation of possession. Right. So the basic genera that you have, on the basis of which you can have relationships, would seem to be reduced to relationships always existing within contrary opposites. And you can't have contrary opposites unless you can establish a relationship. So,
Okay.
so relationships always exist within organizations. If you can't form an organization, you can't have a relationship. And the organization presupposes that you establish a relationship. Now, the relationship might be a kind of master-slave relation, not very like, well, they gave the example of the boss versus the leader. But you have to establish that kind of a relationship with an organization, and good leaders are always able to do that, whether you're not might be a goodwill leader like Peter DeMarco talks about. You might be Saddam Hussein, but you establish that relationship, and in that way you can form an organization. It might be dysfunctional, pathological organization.
But what would the relationship be between the Association of MDs, medical doctors, and bricklayers?
Well, it could be one of art. It is one of art in a way.
But it's not a very dynamic relationship. It's not a very active.
Well,
it's a stretch.
It's a remote relationship.
It's a stretch.
But in a way, both of them are using leaden rules.
I know, you're stretching.
But you're including them. If you're establishing a relationship.
But it's not existential.
Well, no, of course it would be existential. The art would be existential.
There's no dynamic relationship there.
But between the
Or a pragmatic relationship.
Well, both of them, if both of them are engaged in arts, it would be a
Sure. We're in the sandbox again.
Well, it's a bracketed sentence.
It's a pragmatic relationship, that's it.
But the point that I'm trying to get across is to enter into an intelligible conversation where you're more or less asking the same questions and engaging in productive discussion. You first have to establish that you belong to the same organization. And that way you can talk about being on the same page, because what you're doing is you're specifying the generic relationship. And you're turning it into a specific relationship as both belonging to the same organization. One of the biggest problems that people in organizations have, corporations, in relation to asking questions, is that they're not relating the questions to the specific organizational aim, or some sort of a circumstantial interest that they have to share in common. And if you can't ask the right question, that's why the questions become so important that you ask in starting a conversation, because it's on the basis of asking the right question that you start to specify your relationships with the new organization.
You can't decide the final causality.
Right, and without the final cause, without recognizing you're all sharing numerically one aim, one activity.
That's why Father Tomas referred to peace and love.
Yeah.
You can't decide that as the final.
So if you get rid of that notion of the reality of aims, the reality of ends, you destroy the notion of an organizational whole. It can't possibly exist. And you destroy the understanding of real relationships and of leadership. Now, if that's the case, modernity, and having gotten rid of the notion of forms and things that establish relationships among parts and wholes, have destroyed the notion of leadership. They can't possibly understand what it is.
I have a question for Lois. So in your, speaking of relationships, in your discussion, you talked about the importance of forming a professional relationship between, the professional and the client. And I was wondering, when you had that list, I noted that with most, if not all of them, there's always like a middleman that you have to negotiate with.
Yes, that's.
So what is the relation, how do they function in a professional relationship? What's their role?
Yeah, well, let's say I am the engineer, you have to do an engineer works for a company, and then you have the professionals working for the company, so they have an obligation to the company, who's hiring them. At the same time, a client has hired that company to build a building or a bridge or whatever. And so you have three elements there. So the professional is bound by the organization's practices and so on, but at the same time, he has to have the best interest of the client at heart. Now, there might be tension there, that he might see clients' needs that the company does not see. The company might be managerial, concentrating on the managerial, worrying about the profit margin and so on, whereas the professional, let's say in the case of the Challenger, they saw that this was dangerous and they said, don't launch. But managerial went ahead and said, we are going to launch because you can't quantify to our satisfaction the degradation of the organ. So that's a very dramatic tragedy example of your question, that there are distinct three elements. And so it makes the relationship of the community more complex perhaps than it ought to be. If the engineer, using him as an example, the engineer has were in business for himself, it would be less difficult to understand. That's why the notion, I think, of group responsibility is a great lacuna in our understanding, because we can't portion out what would it be percentages? It's a bad word to use, but elements of that relationship. Let's say for the teacher, the professor, you're working for an organization, you're working for a university, and the university has its own considerations. And let's say the teachers or professors are guilty of grade inflation, right? Because they want to please the student, encourage a firm student, the psychology that's going on there. But it's to the detriment of the university to do that, because then the university gets a reputation that grad schools and law schools and personnel boards recognize. You can't take an aid from this institution seriously because there's grade inflation in it. So the student in the long run suffers from that inflation. So as you say, there are three elements there, and it does get complicated. Yes.
And what about with, for example, in a doctor's office, you have the nurses who are right under that's your primary contact typically. Yes. So what's my relationship to them?
Well, the doctor is responsible still, even if it's a nurse practitioner, as you know, the doctor is still responsible, because the licensing is gone to the doctor. And here's where the government intrusion can be very uncomfortable, because all of the record keepings, and now I'm told that they have to specify the code of their diagnosis. And so there's a whole coding profession coming into existence now. That, for example, if the doctor were to put the wrong code in diagnosing them, the insurance won't pay. And the same with the article that I gave you on the American Medical Association. Notice they were applying it to Medicare. They studied Medicare patients in that study. It hurts the client because it might be just as good, and the generic version might be just as good as the pharmaceutical version. And so the client making an act of faith, and the doctor will say, of course, whatever you say. But then the insurance might not pay for the top brand that's under copyright. It might pay only for the generic, and so the patient has to pay out of pocket for the gap that's left there between the prices. And what was the name of the person just about a few months ago who raised dramatically the cost of the drug in his company? Do you remember that?
I can see his face.
Yeah, there's a dramatic case of the doctor. If he took the doctors that were in the study to lunch, they probably would sign and prescribe that medication. If it's genuine, if it's really a conflict of interest there, the measure the patient wouldn't be able to take the medication, and who would need financially, would need the generic version of it. It gets very messy, doesn't it? And it's something we haven't dealt with because the professions keep growing, as we mentioned a minute ago. And so this phenomenon is only increasing, where it gets not only is it a one-on-one, A and B, two people involved, it's now there's a third element. You have the organization, usually for which the professional works, and then you have government intrusion. I use the word intrusion, which maybe not. Oversight perhaps is a less loaded word. Government oversight, which then has many regulations that have to be followed. So you have actually four elements very often. Certainly in the medical profession, you have those four elements.
Now, if that's the case, but basically what's happening is you belong to four different genera simultaneously.
Yes.
Which St. Thomas has this dynamic understanding of genus. that it's really incredible when you take a look at it, in that on the unity of the intellect. I guess the article, he talks about the fact that the human heart, well, he makes reference to a nerve, but you can analogously make reference to the human heart, is simultaneously belongs to the genus of biology and medicine, as life generating and health generating. So the biologist is interested in the study of the human heart from the standpoint of the aim of understanding how the nerve contributes to the promotion of life, where, and you can say the same thing about the heart, whereas the medical doctor is looking at the same subject, but from the standpoint of a different genus, health produced, health maintained. And when you take that into an organization, like Lois is talking about, you have, in the case of this intrusion, all of a sudden the person who thinks, well, I belong to one organization, but now I've been forced into another organization, I don't want to join. But now I have to understand the relationship. So I have a whole new host of relationships and regulations, rules that have been established in terms of this end, and I can't get them confused with this end. And as you multiply these relationships, the bureaucracy and the conflicts that are generated by this
Is that what's happened with great inflation? You got turning education to a social project. Because Harvey Mansfield, during his last days at Harvard, he discovered that 90% of the freshman class was on the dean's honors list. And he complained about this. He said, how could this be? And the dean said, hey, they're at Harvard. They've got to be qualified to be on the dean's honors list. Well, he thought this was nuts. And so it's this confusion of you have a social project. That's progressive.
You get all your relationships. I mean, just functioning as an only human being is difficult enough. But if you don't have this understanding of the reality of the genus, in the sense of the reality of an organization, right? And you deny the reality of organizations like the Enlightenment crowd tends to do. You think that they were as categories of the intellect or something, and they're not, don't have a kind of independent reality to them. Then trying to function on a daily basis in healthy relationships that are constantly coming into conflict becomes enormously difficult, if not impossible.
Did you see that another article he wrote recently in the Wall Street Journal on the same topic?
Oh, really?
Where he actually said the way he deals with this is, in fact, he officially gives an A on their transcript for the university, but then he keeps a separate grade in his own grade book, which is his own real grade, and which is how he remembers how he will write the reference letter. So you see, he has turned the institution into a false, he tells them it's a false.
What's your feeling on the importance of listening more to organizations?
Oh, he's a real martyr. He'd be a real martyr. In the case of the Mountain Bike Club, it was Roger, how do you pronounce his last name? B-O-I-S. Bosley, I think you pronounce it. Roger Bosley was the whistleblower. He was the head of the engineering group that worked for Mountain Bike Club, and they made his life unbearable after that. He went into a slump, depression, physical illness. It was really bad for him.
Well, so it happened with the old rigs, but we had a guy working for me, running Kansas Engineering at the time. So I ended up with engineering about the Apostolic. So the guy said, you run it, so. I worked a lot about engineering. Chet Spica was our senior drafter. Now, senior drafter in those days was highly respected. We probably knew more about engineering than most of the engineers because he worked on very practical projects. He worked on that project, and he said all the drafters, it was well known that this was throughout the whole company. It wasn't just the one engineer. This was an accident just waiting to happen. It was a dumb concept, and especially if they were trying to lay it out on the board and so forth. So often happens, the devil is in the details. They began to see, and so when you went to management, you made the classic violation of prudence, because you said, I want it right now. Well, in engineering, you can never have it right now. It's not going to be right for now. If you want it now, it won't be right if it's right and so forth. And so, what the point I'm trying to make is, there was this incredible pressure that goes through the whole company, right down to the janitor. If you want to save your job, we got to test this thing and get it up there. And the only solution or the only salvation, the only possible, is the courageous martyr, whistleblower, and then he's finished. So companies have to structure in the protection of the whistleblower they have. He's 50 on to it, yes, but the whistleblower in many ways is far more important. It really has to be protected in ways of secrecy, otherwise it's like smoke.
And that's a discouraging part of that whole relationship was that NASA turned the screws on the Octopi 12, threatening that unless you launch right away, we will no longer give you the contract for this
It
discovery.
was the right balance. That's the thing I'm going to touch on Mike's talk this afternoon. When you get under pressure of competition, traditional ethics and decision-making goes out the window when the manager says, everybody's job hangs on getting this thing out there.
But nobody likes a snitch, so how do you build in?
Well, you have to make it secret. You have to, you build into the organization that he's protected when he goes in. That has to be guaranteed. You have to sign off and he's protected from anybody.
Do companies do that?
Sometimes, some are, yeah.
Well, I think that it's time for a break before the next session. We should have some refreshments outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back in about a half hour.